The congregation of Graceful Redemption Pentecostal Church had gathered for a momentous celebration, the church's 5th anniversary. The sanctuary was filled with the harmonious sounds of hymns, the air thick with devotion and joy. Pastor Jeremiah Atkins, the charismatic leader who had guided the church from its humble beginnings, stood at the pulpit, his voice resonating with passion and faith. Suddenly, the heavy wooden doors of the sanctuary swung open with a resounding crash. Gasps echoed through the pews as all eyes turned to the entrance. There stood Sheila Johnson, a woman unknown to most of the congregation, her face a mask of anguish and fury. In her trembling hand, she clutched a firearm, its presence starkly out of place in the house of worship. "You can't ignore us anymore, Jeremiah," she screamed, her voice cracking with emotion. Beside her stood a young girl, Zoe, her wide eyes filled with confusion and fear. The sanctuary, once filled with songs of praise, now buzzed with whispers of shock and disbelief. Before anyone could react, Sheila raised the gun, aiming directly at Pastor Atkins. 3 shots rang out in rapid succession, each one amplifying the horror that gripped the congregation. Jeremiah staggered, crimson spreading across his pristine white robe, before collapsing at the foot of the altar. Screams erupted, and chaos ensued as parishioners scrambled for safety. As the echoes of gunfire faded, the reality of the situation settled over the church like a suffocating shroud. Sheila stood motionless, the weapon slipping from her grasp, her expression a tumult of rage, sorrow, and a haunting sense of vindication. Isabella Atkins, Jeremiah's devoted wife, rushed to her husband's side, her cries of despair piercing the stunned silence. What could drive a woman to commit such a brazen act in a sacred place, in front of so many witnesses? What secrets had Pastor Atkins harbored that led to this violent confrontation? As the congregation grappled with the shocking events, questions swirled, and the true story behind the facade of the esteemed pastor began to unravel. What would you do if someone you trusted revealed a hidden life that shattered your world? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Before we go deeper into the story, we welcome you to our channel, True Crime Zone HQ. Thank you to all our viewers and a special shout out to our subscribers for your continued support. Together, we strive to improve and bring you daily updates on both told and untold true crime stories. Please don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you haven't. Long before the gunfire shattered the sanctity of Graceful Redemption Pentecostal Church, before the man in white robes lay bleeding at the foot of his own altar, there was a story that began in the rough streets of South Atlanta. A story of ambition, faith, deception, and betrayal. A story that, for years, had been carefully hidden beneath polished sermons and righteous words. Pastor Jeremiah Atkins wasn't always a man of God. Born into hardship, raised by a single grandmother who worked tirelessly to keep him on the right path, his childhood was anything but easy. South Atlanta wasn't kind to young boys with restless spirits and little direction. It was a world where survival often depended on how fast you could run, how sharp your words could cut, and how easily you could slip into the background when trouble came knocking. But Jeremiah wasn't like the other kids. He had a presence about him, a natural ability to command attention. His words could draw people in, convince them, move them. And as a teenager, he used that gift in ways that made his grandmother lose sleep at night. He ran with a crowd that saw potential in him, not for good, but for the kind of influence that could be used to get what they wanted. He was charming, persuasive, and when he spoke, people listened. For a time, that path seemed set. Until the night that changed everything. A drive-by shooting on the very streets he had once ruled left his best friend gasping for breath in his arms. Blood pooling beneath him. Life fading from his eyes. Jeremiah felt something shift inside him. A moment of reckoning. The next morning, instead of roaming the streets, he found himself stepping through the doors of a small church, sitting in the back row, and letting the weight of his choices crash over him. It was there that Mama Hester, his grandmother, found him. She had spent years praying for this moment, for the boy she raised to finally see what she always had, that his voice, his presence, his influence could be used for something far greater than himself. And Jeremiah listened. He threw himself into scripture with the same fervor he once used to navigate the streets. He learned, studied, and soon, he wasn't just sitting in the congregation, he was leading it. His testimony was powerful, his redemption story gripping. He knew how to speak to the people because he had walked the same roads they had. It didn't take long before he was standing at pulpits, leading youth ministries, and eventually, founding his own church. At just 30 years old, Pastor Jeremiah Atkins had built Graceful Redemption Pentecostal Church from the ground up, starting in a modest rented storefront and growing it into one of the fastest-growing congregations in Atlanta. He had become a beacon of faith, a man of influence, a leader who spoke of salvation in second chances. But there was one thing Jeremiah never managed to escape, himself. Beneath the robes, behind the powerful words, he was still that boy from South Atlanta. A man who could command attention, win hearts, and manipulate emotions. A man who had always known how to get what he wanted. And then came Sheila Johnson. She wasn't like the other women who gravitated toward Jeremiah's sermons. She wasn't soft-spoken, pious, or eager to be molded into the image of a pastor's wife. Sheila was fire. Bold. Unapologetic. A woman who carried herself with the kind of confidence that turned heads and left an impression long after she walked away. They met at a community center, where Jeremiah was speaking to a group of troubled teens. Sheila was there to pick up her younger brother, and she had no patience for waiting. She stormed in, demanding to know why the program had run late, why she had to rearrange her schedule for something she had never asked for in the first place. Jeremiah saw her before she even realized he was watching. There was something about her. The way she didn't back down. The way her words cut through the air with absolute certainty. He had spent his life commanding rooms, but Sheila, she didn't need an audience. She already knew her worth. Their first conversation was a battle of wills. Sparks flew, not of tenderness, but of something far more volatile. He challenged her, and she challenged him right back. It was electric. And it wasn't long before their paths began crossing more and more, first by chance, then by choice. What started as an exchange of words became something else entirely. Something Jeremiah knew he had no business entertaining. Sheila was everything he wasn't supposed to want. A reminder of the life he had left behind, the passion he had once thrived on, the danger of playing with fire. But he wanted her. And for a time, he convinced himself it was okay. That a man could serve God and still have desires. That no one had to know. That as long as he was careful, as long as he kept his personal life separate from his public one, there was no harm done. But secrets have a way of demanding to be acknowledged. Sheila wasn't the type of woman who accepted being hidden in the shadows. She wanted more. More time, more commitment. More of the man she had fallen for. And when she told him she was pregnant, she believed, truly believed, that this would be the moment Jeremiah finally stepped up. That he would claim her. Claim their child. That the love he whispered in the dark would become something tangible. But Sheila had underestimated Jeremiah's greatest love, his image. A child out of wedlock, an affair, a scandal. It would ruin him. Everything he had built. Everything he had convinced the world he was. So he made a choice. He would support her. Quietly. Financially. But Sheila and their unborn child, they would never be part of his public life. Sheila was devastated. She had given him everything. And now, she was nothing more than a liability. A mistake to be erased. But Jeremiah thought he could fix it. That as long as he provided, as long as he played the role of a distant benefactor, Sheila would accept the arrangement. He had always been able to talk his way out of anything. He was wrong. As the years passed, Sheila's resentment grew. She raised their daughter, Zoe, alone, watching as Jeremiah continued his rise. The final blow came when she learned of his marriage to Isabella Green, the woman who fit the image of the perfect pastor's wife, gentle, faithful, and blissfully unaware of the truth. Seeing them together, seeing Isabella standing beside him at church functions, smiling as though she had been given the life Sheila had once dreamed of, filled her with a sense of rage she could no longer contain. Jeremiah had convinced himself that he had successfully managed his double life, but the truth had a way of finding its way to the surface. It all began to unravel one evening when Isabella overheard a phone call that changed everything. She had been passing by Jeremiah's study when she heard the tension in his voice, the unmistakable sound of a man pleading for control over something slipping beyond his reach. She wasn't meant to hear the name he spoke in that moment, but she did. She froze as she heard him whisper, "Sheila, please. Not now. Just give me more time." Confused and unsettled, Isabella pressed herself against the door, straining to hear more. There was silence, followed by a voice on the other end of the line, sharp, firm, and filled with bitterness. "I'm done waiting, Jeremiah." And then the line went dead. Isabella had always trusted her husband without hesitation, but something about this call set off alarms in her mind. The way he had spoken, the urgency, the name that rang in her ears long after the conversation had ended, it all felt wrong. Her hands trembled as she reached for the door handle, pushing it open just enough to see the look on Jeremiah's face. He stood there, holding the phone, and for the first time since she had known him, she saw something foreign in his expression, fear. When she demanded to know the truth, Jeremiah hesitated, scrambling for the right words. But there was no way to soften what he had been hiding. Slowly, the confession unraveled. There was another woman. There was a child. There were years of deception, money sent in secret, and promises he had made that he could never keep. As he spoke, Isabella felt as though the foundation of her life had been ripped out from beneath her. The man she had loved, the man she had vowed to stand beside, had lied to her for their entire marriage. She wanted to leave. The betrayal was too much to bear, the pain unbearable. But Jeremiah, desperate to keep what little control he had left, begged her to stay. He swore that he would make things right, that if she could just stand beside him for one last service, they could handle this together. Against her better judgment, against the overwhelming instinct telling her to walk away, Isabella agreed. She would stand beside him, not for his sake, but for the sake of the church and the people who looked up to them. But while Jeremiah was pleading for his wife's forgiveness, Sheila was reaching the breaking point. The years of being ignored, the empty promises, the rejection, it had all built up into something she could no longer contain. She had spent too long being patient, believing that Jeremiah would eventually do right by her and Zoe. Now, she realized that it had all been a lie. He had chosen Isabella. He had erased her and their daughter from his life. Sitting in the dim light of her apartment, Sheila stared at the framed photograph of Zoe, their child, the innocent girl who had been forced to grow up without the father who had once claimed to love her. The anger that had simmered for years finally reached its breaking point. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was about her daughter. This was about the shame she had been forced to carry while Jeremiah stood before a congregation and played the role of a man she knew he wasn't. As the anniversary service at Graceful Redemption Church approached, Sheila made a decision. She wouldn't be ignored any longer. She wouldn't allow Zoe to grow up as a secret, a child whose existence had been brushed aside for the sake of a pastor's reputation. Jeremiah had made his choice. Now, she would make hers. She stood up from the couch, walked to the small dresser in the corner of the room, and pulled open the bottom drawer. Her hands found what she was looking for, the cold weight of it pressing against her palm. She had never imagined it would come to this, but the time for patience had long passed. That Sunday morning, as Jeremiah slipped on his white pastoral robe, preparing to step onto the pulpit and deliver what he believed would be his redemption, Sheila dressed Zoe in her best clothes and held her daughter's hand as they stepped out the door. They were going to church. But today, it wouldn't be a sermon that people remembered. Today, the truth would no longer be hidden. And today, for the first time in 5 years, Pastor Jeremiah Atkins would finally acknowledge the family he had left behind. Sunday morning arrived with a kind of stillness that felt almost unnatural, as if the city itself was holding its breath. Inside Graceful Redemption Pentecostal Church, the atmosphere was entirely different. The congregation filled the pews, their voices rising in song, their hands lifted in worship, completely unaware that this service would be one they would never forget. It was the church's 5th anniversary, a day of celebration and gratitude, a moment to reflect on all they had built under the guidance of their beloved pastor Jeremiah Atkins. There was a joyous energy in the air, an anticipation for the sermon to come, for the powerful words that always left them inspired, renewed in faith. At the front of the church, Isabella Atkins sat with a composed smile, her hands resting in her lap, her posture perfectly poised. On the outside, she was the picture of a devoted pastor's wife, the very image of grace. But inside, she was hollow, the weight of her husband's betrayal pressing down on her like an unbearable burden. She had spent the night crying in silence, unable to sleep, unable to reconcile the truth she now knew with the man she had vowed to stand beside. Another woman. A child. 5 years of deception. Every whispered prayer, every moment she had spent believing in their marriage, it had all been a lie. And yet, she was here. Because Jeremiah had begged her to be. Behind the curtain, in the small room where he prepared for his sermons, Pastor Jeremiah stood alone, gripping the edges of the lectern. His heart pounded in his chest, his throat dry. He had delivered hundreds of sermons in his lifetime, but never before had he stepped onto the pulpit with so much at stake. He had convinced himself that if he could just get through this service, if he could stand before his congregation and preach like he always had, maybe, just maybe, he could fix the mess he had created. He could talk to Isabella later, make her understand, find a way to repair the damage. And Sheila, he would handle her. It was a fragile illusion, one that would shatter in mere minutes. Taking a deep breath, Jeremiah straightened his robe, wiped the sweat from his palms, and stepped out onto the stage. The crowd erupted in applause. Smiling faces. A sea of devoted believers, hanging on his every word. He raised his hands to quiet them, offering a warm, practiced smile. My brothers and sisters in Christ, today is a day of celebration. A day of reflection. A day of gratitude for the blessings we have received. His voice was smooth, controlled, as if nothing was wrong. As if his entire world wasn't hanging by a thread. And then, the doors at the back of the church burst open. The sound was deafening, like a thunderclap that silenced the entire congregation in an instant. Heads whipped around, the murmurs of confusion growing louder. All eyes turned toward the entrance. Standing in the doorway, Sheila Johnson did not hesitate. She stepped forward, her breath heavy, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. Her hair was disheveled, her eyes filled with an emotion so raw it sent a chill through the room. But it wasn't just her presence that sent a wave of unease through the sanctuary. It was the little girl standing beside her. Zoe, the child who had been hidden from this church, from this congregation, from the world that Jeremiah had so carefully built. Whispers spread through the pews like wildfire. No one knew who this woman was, but something about the look on her face, the fury in her stance, told them that something was very, very wrong. She took another step forward, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. You can't ignore us anymore, Jeremiah. The congregation froze, heads turning back to their pastor. Jeremiah's blood ran cold. From where she sat, Isabella felt her stomach twist into a knot. She had thought she knew the depths of her husband's betrayal. She had been wrong. Because this was something far worse. Sheila's hand gripped Zoe tightly, the little girl looking up at her mother, confused by the tension in the room, by the weight of the moment she didn't yet understand. Tell them, Sheila's voice trembled, but her anger gave it strength. Tell them who we are, Jeremiah. Tell them about your daughter. A stunned gasp rippled through the congregation. Eyes darted back to their pastor, searching for a reaction, a denial, something. Jeremiah swallowed hard. He had two choices. Tell the truth. Or try, one last time, to lie his way out of it. He lifted his hand slightly, a weak attempt to calm the situation. Sheila, he started, his voice softer now. This is not the time. We can talk about this in private. Private? Sheila let out a hollow laugh, shaking her head. That's all we ever were to you, wasn't it? Private. A secret. The congregation was silent, their shock almost tangible. From the front row, Isabella sat frozen, her hands clenched so tightly her nails dug into her palms. Jeremiah's voice dropped lower, a plea. Please, just put Zoe first. Let's go somewhere and talk. But Sheila was past the point of talking. She had given him time. She had given him chances. And he had erased her. No one saw the gun until it was too late. One moment, Sheila's hands were empty. The next, a small pistol was clutched in her trembling fingers. A collective gasp filled the room. People shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some moved, unsure if this was real, if this was actually happening in a house of worship. Jeremiah froze in place. Sheila, he whispered. Please. Put it down. She shook her head. Tears burned in her eyes. You stood up there and lied to these people, week after week, she said, voice thick with emotion. You stood up there and talked about family, about love, about faith. And all this time, you were lying. Jeremiah couldn't move. Isabella's breath hitched in her throat. And then, the first shot rang out. The sound shattered the silence, a deafening crack that echoed through the sanctuary. Jeremiah stumbled back, his white robe suddenly blooming red. The second shot, his legs gave out. The third, he collapsed at the foot of the altar. The congregation erupted into chaos. Screams tore through the air, people scrambling for the exits, some frozen in place, too stunned to move. Isabella lunged forward, falling to her knees beside her husband. Her hands pressed against the wound, her fingers slick with blood. Jeremiah's eyes fluttered, his breath coming in shallow gasps. Across the room, Sheila stood frozen. The gun slipped from her grip, clattering to the floor. Zoe, standing only feet away, looked up at her mother in confusion, her small voice barely audible over the chaos. Mommy? Sheila's body trembled. For 5 years, she had waited for this moment. For 5 years, she had wanted him to acknowledge her. And now, it was too late. The sounds of sirens filled the air, growing louder, closing in. The doors of Graceful Redemption Church had been flung open only minutes ago. Now, for the first time in its history, they would be closing, for crime scene investigators. The doors of the church flew open again, this time with a swarm of uniformed officers storming inside, weapons drawn, barking orders for everyone to get down. Within seconds, they had Sheila surrounded. She didn't run. She didn't resist. She just stood there, her gaze unfocused, her lips slightly parted, as if she was trying to process how she had gone from pleading for Jeremiah's acknowledgement to standing over his bleeding body. The officers tackled her to the ground, wrenching her arms behind her back, securing the cuffs around her wrists. As they pulled her to her feet, her gaze drifted to the altar, to the man gasping for air as his wife sobbed beside him. Tell them, Jeremiah, she whispered as they led her away. Tell them the truth now. Outside, police cars filled the church parking lot, their flashing lights casting eerie patterns on the pavement. Paramedics rushed through the crowd, making their way to the pulpit where Isabella knelt beside her husband, pressing her hands against his wounds, her face streaked with tears. She whispered his name over and over, her voice breaking, her hands shaking as she tried to stop the bleeding. Stay with me, she pleaded. Please, God, stay with me. Jeremiah's lips moved, but no sound came out. His chest rose and fell in short, uneven breaths, his eyelids fluttering as if he were struggling to remain conscious. The paramedics worked quickly, lifting his limp body onto a stretcher, their voices urgent as they called out his vitals. Within moments, he was being rushed toward the waiting ambulance, his fate uncertain. But inside the church, the damage had already been done. The congregation stood in stunned silence, watching as the man they had once admired was carried away. The weight of the moment settled over them like a suffocating fog. Their leader had fallen, and the truth, long buried, had finally been forced into the light. The story spread like wildfire. Within hours, news stations had picked up the footage captured by horrified churchgoers, blasting it across television screens and social media feeds. Breaking news: pastor shot in front of congregation by alleged mistress. Scandal at Graceful Redemption: the double life of Pastor Jeremiah Atkins. Every headline told a different version of the same horrifying tale, but the truth was worse than anyone could have imagined. As investigators dug into Jeremiah's past, the skeletons hidden in his closet began to tumble out one by one. First, the affair. The secret daughter. The years of deception. Then, the money. Financial records revealed that Jeremiah hadn't just been supporting Sheila and Zoe. He had been using church funds to do it. Thousands of dollars had been funneled into accounts under different names, carefully disguised as ministry expenses, outreach programs, charity work. In reality, it had been hush money, an attempt to keep his sins buried beneath the surface. The congregation was stunned. Some refused to believe it. Others felt angry, betrayed, humiliated. The man they had followed, the man they had trusted, had lied to them all. The church doors, once open to welcome hundreds every Sunday, were now taped off as a crime scene, reporters swarming outside, desperate to capture every new revelation. For days, Jeremiah clung to life in the ICU, undergoing multiple surgeries as doctors worked to repair the damage. The bullets had missed his heart but shattered his ribcage, punctured a lung, and caused significant internal bleeding. He survived. But his life as he knew it was over. Lying in a hospital bed, wires and tubes keeping him stable, he had no pulpit to return to. No congregation to stand before. No reputation left to salvage. And beside him, Isabella watched in silence, no longer certain of the man she had once loved. She had stood by him in the past, had believed in the man she thought he was. But now, as she looked at the broken figure in the hospital bed, all she saw was a stranger. For Sheila she faces trial. The charges against her were severe: attempted murder, aggravated assault, reckless endangerment. The media painted her as a woman scorned, a jealous ex-lover who had taken revenge in the most violent way possible. But not everyone saw her that way. Some sympathized with her. Some saw a woman who had been used, discarded, erased. A woman who had spent years begging for acknowledgement, only to be cast aside like she had never mattered. Her lawyer argued that she had been driven to the breaking point, pushed into an emotional and psychological torment that finally snapped. But no matter how tragic her circumstances, the facts remained the same. She had pulled the trigger. She had almost killed a man. And now, she would pay the price. For days, Isabella sat in silence, watching over her husband, trying to decide what she would do next. She had spent her marriage living in an illusion, believing in a love that had never truly existed. Now, she had to make a choice. Did she stand by Jeremiah? Did she walk away? Or did she find her own path forward, free from the lies, free from the burden of being the perfect pastor's wife to a man who had never been faithful to her? And in that moment, as she looked at the man lying helpless in a hospital bed, she realized the truth. Their marriage had died the moment she discovered the secret. Now, she had to decide whether she was ready to bury it for good. Time has a way of moving forward, even when lives remain frozen in the wreckage of a single moment. The events inside Graceful Redemption Pentecostal Church had sent shockwaves far beyond its walls. The blood that stained the altar that day had not only ended Jeremiah Atkins' career, it had shattered the faith of an entire community. The congregation that had once gathered in that sanctuary, lifting their hands in worship, had scattered. Some left in disgust, feeling betrayed by the man they had trusted. Others clung to their faith, desperately trying to separate their belief in God from the actions of the man who had stood before them week after week. But one thing was certain: Graceful Redemption Church would never exist again. Within months of the shooting, the doors of the church were permanently closed. The once thriving ministry, built on the foundation of Jeremiah's charisma and influence, had collapsed under the weight of his deception. The board of elders held emergency meetings, debating whether the church could be salvaged, whether its reputation could be restored. But there was no redemption left to be found in those walls. In the end, the decision was made. The towering sign that once bore Jeremiah's name and the words Graceful Redemption Pentecostal Church was taken down, replaced with something new. Hope Restoration Community Center. It was no longer a place of grand sermons or self-proclaimed prophets. Instead, it became a space for outreach, support groups, and community healing. A place where those who had been broken, not just by Jeremiah, but by life itself, could find help, guidance, and a way forward. But for the man who had once been at the heart of it all, there was no restoring what had been lost. Then for Sheila Johnson, she pleaded guilty to attempted murder and aggravated assault. There would be no drawn-out trial, no media spectacle beyond what had already played out. The footage of her standing in the church, her hands trembling as she held the gun, was more than enough to seal her fate. She was sentenced to 12 years in prison, a punishment lighter than some had expected, but heavier than others believed she deserved. For the first few months, Sheila remained silent. She refused interviews, ignored letters from journalists who wanted to turn her story into sensational headlines. She had spent years screaming to be heard, and yet now, she had nothing left to say. But prison has a way of forcing reflection. Somewhere between the cold walls and the long, quiet nights, Sheila found clarity. She couldn't change what she had done. She couldn't undo the pain she had caused. But she could decide what she would do with the years ahead. And so, over time, Sheila became a voice. Not for revenge. Not for hatred. But for women like her, single mothers, struggling to be seen, fighting to survive in a world that often left them behind. She started writing letters, speaking to organizations, sharing her story in the hopes that others would never find themselves in the same place she had. Years later, when she was finally released, she walked out of prison not as the woman who had walked in, but as someone determined to rebuild a life with meaning. But one thing would remain unchanged: Zoe. The daughter she had fought for. The child she had once wanted Jeremiah to acknowledge. Now, she had to face the reality that Zoe had grown up without her. And that there was someone else who had taken on the responsibility she had left behind. For Pastor Jeremiah Atkins, he never returned to the pulpit. The moment he had built his life around, the moment when everything came crashing down inside that church, had sealed his fate. After recovering from his injuries, Jeremiah was convicted of financial fraud, the evidence stacked against him. He had stolen from his own church, drained funds meant for ministry work to support his double life. He was sentenced to 5 years in prison. There was no fanfare, no one waiting for him when he was released. The world moved on without him. The man who had once commanded the attention of hundreds now lived in near total obscurity, working odd jobs, trying to stay out of the public eye. There were no invitations to preach. No congregation to welcome him back. But he did one thing. He tried to make amends. He wrote letters, to Isabella, to Zoe, even to Sheila. Some were answered. Others were not. But no matter how much he repented, no matter how much he tried to justify his past actions, one truth remained: he had built his life on lies, and in the end, it was those lies that destroyed him. For Isabella, the decision had been painful, but clear. The day Jeremiah was sentenced, she walked away from him. From the marriage that had been built on deception. From the life she had once imagined. But she did not walk away from Zoe. The little girl who had been caught in the storm of her parents' destruction, the child whose face had been the final piece of truth Isabella had needed to see. She didn't do it out of obligation. She did it because she wanted to. She wanted Zoe to grow up in a home where love was not conditional. Where she was not a secret. And so, over time, Zoe became family. She grew up not as Jeremiah Atkins' hidden daughter, but as a girl with a mother figure who truly saw her. Years passed. Zoe grew. And then, one day, Sheila stood at Isabella's doorstep. It was their first real meeting since that day in court. For a long moment, neither woman spoke. But then, Sheila looked into Isabella's eyes and asked the only question that mattered. Is she happy? Isabella didn't hesitate. Yes. She is. There was no hatred left between them. No need for apologies or explanations. Just an unspoken understanding. They had both lost. They had both suffered. And yet, in the end, they had both done the one thing that mattered most. They had protected Zoe. The story of Pastor Jeremiah Atkins, Sheila Johnson, and Isabella Green is more than just a tale of betrayal and violence. It is a story of choices, consequences, and the irreversible damage caused by deception. The events that took place inside Graceful Redemption Pentecostal Church on that fateful Sunday morning were not the result of a single moment but the culmination of years of hidden truths, unspoken resentments, and broken promises. As the dust settled, the question remained, who was truly to blame? Was it Jeremiah Atkins, the charismatic pastor who built his life around a carefully constructed image of righteousness while secretly leading a double life? He was the one who made promises he never intended to keep, who kept Sheila and their daughter Zoe in the shadows, and who lied to his wife Isabella from the very beginning. Had he simply been honest, would any of this have happened? Or was his downfall inevitable? Or was it Sheila Johnson, the woman who had spent years waiting for recognition, believing that one day Jeremiah would do right by her and their daughter? When that moment never came, she was left standing on the outside, watching him build a life with another woman while she struggled to raise their child alone. Was her act of violence a crime of passion, the reaction of a mother who had finally had enough? Or was it a calculated decision, driven by revenge and years of pent-up rage? And then there was Isabella Green, the devoted wife who had no idea that her marriage was built on a lie. Was she simply an innocent victim, a woman blindsided by a man who had manipulated her into believing he was someone he was not? Or were there signs all along that she chose not to see? Should she have questioned more, pushed harder, and discovered the truth before it was too late? These questions have no easy answers. But one thing remains certain, no one walked away from this story unscathed. When Sheila walked into the church that day, she wasn't just a woman confronting her ex-lover, she was a mother demanding justice for her child. But was that justice worth the price she paid? Did she enter the church knowing she would pull the trigger? Or did the sight of Jeremiah standing at the pulpit, speaking to a congregation that adored him, while Zoe remained an unspoken secret, push her past the point of no return? Was it the anger of a scorned woman or the pain of a mother who had been forced to watch her child grow up in the shadows? Could she have walked away and found another way to make Jeremiah pay for what he had done? Or was violence the only option left in her mind after being ignored for so long? Some believe Sheila was a victim of Jeremiah's selfishness, a woman who had given her love to the wrong man and paid the ultimate price for it. Others argue that her actions were not justified, no matter the pain she felt. What do you think? Was Sheila a woman pushed to her breaking point, or was she fully responsible for the choice she made that day? Let us know in the comments. For years, Jeremiah had convinced himself that he was in control. He had managed to keep two separate lives, carefully ensuring that neither one spilled over into the other. To the outside world, he was a devoted husband, a powerful preacher, and a man of faith. But behind closed doors, he was someone entirely different. He had an affair. He had a child he refused to acknowledge publicly. And worst of all, he continued to build a life based on deception, using the people who trusted him as stepping stones for his own gain. When Isabella stood in that church pew, looking at Sheila and Zoe for the first time, her world crumbled. How could she have missed the signs? Did she ignore small red flags because she wanted to believe in the man she had married? Had she been so blinded by love and faith that she never stopped to ask herself if she truly knew the man standing beside her? And when she finally discovered the truth, what should she have done? Should she have stood by Jeremiah, despite the lies and the betrayal? Or did she make the right choice by walking away, leaving the life she thought she had behind? Would you have forgiven him? If you were in Isabella's position, what would you have done? Tell us in the comments. In the aftermath of the shooting, there was one person who suffered more than anyone else. Zoe. She was a child who had never asked for this. She had never asked to be hidden, never asked to be kept out of sight while her father built a life that didn't include her. She was just a little girl who wanted to be loved, acknowledged, and protected. Instead, she watched her mother get arrested. She saw her father nearly die in front of her. She was taken from everything she had known and placed in the care of a woman who was supposed to be her father's wife. For years, Zoe had no say in what happened to her. And yet, in the end, it was Isabella, not Sheila or Jeremiah, who made sure Zoe had a home, a future, and a chance to grow up without the weight of her parents' mistakes. But how does a child recover from something like this? How does a little girl move forward, knowing that her mother pulled the trigger and her father never wanted the world to know she existed? Zoe may have escaped the chaos of her parents' choices, but she will forever carry the burden of their mistakes. At its core, this is a story about choices. Jeremiah made the choice to lie. Sheila made the choice to confront him. And in the end, one decision led to a moment that changed their lives forever. But what if things had been different? What if Jeremiah had been honest from the beginning? Would he have lost Isabella but kept his dignity, his congregation, and possibly his life as he knew it? What if Sheila had walked away? Could she have moved on, built a new life, and left Jeremiah to deal with his own self-inflicted downfall? What if Isabella had uncovered the truth sooner? Would she have been able to protect herself from the pain before it was too late? These are the questions that remain unanswered. But what we do know is this: no one won. Jeremiah lost everything. Sheila lost her freedom. Isabella lost the life she thought she had. And Zoe lost the family she should have had from the start. And in the end, it wasn't fate that tore them apart. It wasn't a random tragedy. It was a series of choices. A web of deception. A reality built on lies. And one moment of irreversible destruction. Now, we turn the questions over to you. Who is truly responsible for what happened? Was this all Jeremiah's fault, or did Sheila take things too far? Should Isabella have known sooner, or was she just another victim in this story? And most importantly, could any of this have been avoided? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We read every comment, and we want to hear what you think about this case. Do you believe Sheila's actions were justified, or was she completely in the wrong? If you found this story compelling, make sure to hit the like button so we can keep bringing you more in-depth crime stories like this one. And if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss a story that keeps you on the edge of your seat. We post new crime stories every week, bringing you the most shocking, intriguing, and unbelievable cases from around the world. Thank you for watching, and until next time, stay safe, stay aware, and always remember, one decision, one lie, and a lifetime of regret.